Back at their hotel in Trier, Ted Barris, son of a 94th Infantry Division medic and author of Rush to Danger, would host a lecture on his book about the Great Escape.
Now kids, I don't want any tip-tapping on your phones in the back there. I want undivided attention. You know what, I taught for 20 years. Hi, Bob. And what I said to the students when they came in, well, we got to have our phones with us. I said, okay, put them in your pocket, because when you take them out of your pockets, I consider it the same as smoking in my classroom. And they thought about it for a second and accepted that as a reasonable parallel.
Exactly right.
Let me start by saying, if I may, I've been gathering veteran stories for about 40 years. About 5 years ago, when Jane, my wife, and I were in Berlin, on our way back to Canada, I got an email from the Veterans Affairs Department in Canada, which is the equivalent, I guess, of, is it Veterans? Yeah, it's the DVA, right, in the States. We have the Veterans Affairs Department, Veterans Affairs Canada. Anyway, I got an email, and they said, "Is this Ted Barris, writer, blah, blah, blah," and I emailed back, and then I got in touch with them, and they said, "We want you to be in Canada on such and such a date." I said, "Excuse me, you have the right Ted Barris? I'm not a veteran." They said, "Yeah, we have the right." So it wasn't so humbling because it was the Minister of Veterans Affairs commendation, or that it was coming from that department, but that it had come from veterans was so much an honor. So every time I speak in public, I thank the veterans for the honor of wearing this pin. Whether they're American or Canadian or wherever they are, it's an honor, and without the stories of veterans, which is what I gather, I would be nothing. I have nothing unless, and Vim and I recognize that value, and others, I'm sure, who've gathered stories. Brian, you know what gathering history is all about. Anyway, that's just to get started. So the story really begins with Hollywood. This is the poster that was published in 1963 when the movie came out. All the big names, Steve McQueen, James Garner, Richard Attenborough. But probably the most important name is this one down here, a guy named John Sturgis. John Sturgis was the producer who sought the rights from Paul Brickhill, who wrote the original book, The Great Escape. He was an Australian, he was actually in the camp. And he wrote the first book called The Great Escape. Now, Sturgis now takes 10 years to get the rights to the book. And they would take all the camps, empty them, and put all the repeat offenders into one camp that was decidedly inescapable. So you got all the repeat offenders at Stalag Luft 3 beginning in 1942. Well, what's the flip side of that? You got all the bad guys in one place, you got all the brain trust in one place, you've got the makings of a great escape with all those escape artists in one place, right? Very emotional. And they come home and they fall out of these aircraft onto British soil and they're weeping. They're immediately taken to delousing areas where their uniforms are burned, they're deloused, they're given rich food which they can't stomach because they've been living on horrible food in the camps, so they're puking, they're deloused again, more uniforms are burned. These poor guys were in a merry-go-round for weeks. Some of them even tried to steal planes to get home. One of them. George Harsh was, and Kingsley Brown tried to steal an aircraft, a flying Sunderland, a flying boat. Anyway, so in the last chapter, I talk about how these guys are all coming home, and of course we talk about it now as post-traumatic stress disorder because we all understand what that's about. It wasn't quite the same then. They come home, and I trace about 15 or 20 of them back to their brothers and sisters, the ones that talked or didn't talk, their parents, the ones that didn't. Or talked or didn't talk. Pengelly went home and the family immediately took him to the family's cabin in northern Ontario so that he could sort of decompress. The only guy he talked to was his younger brother about his experience. I talked to the younger brother about what happened. Anyway, so one last shot. This is from the cover of the book, and you can't see the faces, but this will just give you an idea. These are all Canadians. Tony Pengelly, he's the forger. There's Hank Sprague, he was the guy in charge of the tunnel. There's Johnny Weir, he was the digger. There's the guy who was in charge of the diversions. There's a stooge. There's a guy who was in the theater. And that's all just from Ontario. All the men in the Great Escape from Ontario. And the reason these photographs were done is the guards took them as a goodwill gesture so that they could send them home to their families, so that the families would sense that they were being treated fairly. So this is one way we look at the Great Escape. Here's the scene, jumping over the fence. He insisted on these scenes because Richard Attenborough and James Garner were getting too much screen time, and he wanted to have more to be just as prominent and present. And he did every shot but this one. That was a stunt man. So you see, there's Hollywood's view of the Great Escape, and there's history's view of the Great Escape.
Wow.
Thank you.